Let me ask you, have you even read the United States Constitution? I will gladly lend you my copy.
Thursday afternoon in Portland, Maine, protesters holding up copies of the U.S. Constitution were booed out of a Trump rally.
Sort of rude, you know, when you think of it. And what are we looking for? We want strong military, we want jobs, we want good education, health care, right?
The protest was in support of the speech made by Khizr Khan during the Democratic National Convention. Over the last several days, Trump has been in an all-out battle of words with the family after Khan, the father of a slain U.S. soldier, questioned Donald Trump's commitment to America's founding principles. A poignant moment from Khan came when he memorably held up a miniature copy of the Constitution, challenging him midway through his speech.
As he consolidated federal power over the conquered South, following the death of Abraham the Destroyer, soon-to-be impeached President Andrew Johnson instructed his subordinates that whenever you hear a man prating about the Constitution, spot him as a traitor. The term prating refers to empty, foolish speech. And in this context, what Johnson was saying is that anybody who invoked the United States Constitution for the purpose of criticizing the actions of the military dictatorship in the South, or criticizing what had been done in the North during the war, was to be considered an enemy of the state and perhaps prosecuted for treason. Lysander Spooner, a couple of decades later, would point out that the Constitution is essentially useless as an instrument for protecting individual liberties, but it retains its value, as I had pointed out, as a way of defining, at least to some extent, the endless criminality of the government that presumes to rule us. So if you were to invoke the Bill of Rights or constitutional provisions as a way of criticizing the actions of the federal government, you were to be considered somebody who was disloyal and perhaps be liable for criminal prosecution. And in setting out that principle, Andrew Johnson might well have been inspired by the example of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson, before Andrew Jackson became president. In December of 1814, shortly before the much-discussed and storied Battle of New Orleans, Jackson issued a decree announcing that it was his unalterable determination rigidly to execute the martial law in all cases which should come before my province. In other words, he made himself the military dictator of New Orleans. He was a warlord, to use the contemporary expression. The city of New Orleans would be run as an armed camp. A 9 p.m. curfew was imposed, and anyone found on the streets after that hour would be apprehended as spies and held for examination. Following the battle, which was the only significant American victory in the War of 1812, and it occurred after the war had ended, Jackson refused to restore civilian government. In March, roughly 2 months after that climactic battle, mind you, a member of the Louisiana Senate by the name of Louis Loyer published an anonymous letter in the Louisiana Courier newspaper condemning the continued state of martial law as what he called an affront to our oath of making the Constitution respected. It is high time the laws should resume their empire, Senator Loyer wrote. And he also demanded that the dozens of civilians who were held in military custody be brought before civilian courts and either charged or released, as the writ of habeas corpus demands. Jackson treated this invocation of the U.S. Constitution as the act of a British spy. In other words, he spotted this anonymous author as a traitor, using the same principle that decades later would be employed by Andrew Johnson. So Jackson first commissioned publication of a propaganda sheet called Friend of the Laws that pointedly warned New Orleans residents that those found guilty of espionage within the armed camp would be subject to immediate execution, and then he dispatched agents to learn the identity of his anonymous critic and arrest him. Once Loyer was in military custody, he was accused of acting with, quote, the direct and manifest object of bringing the military authority into contempt, as well as fomenting sedition, which of course is the worthiest undertaking of any individual, by stirring up discontent and mutiny in the camp. That expression meant, once again, the city of New Orleans. At that point, it had become a peacetime environment where civilian courts were in operation. That's a consideration that would later be invoked by the Supreme Court in the ex parte Milligan ruling, which applied habeas corpus even in time of warfare. Commercial life in New Orleans proceeded without molestation by anyone other than Jackson's minions. So normalcy had descended in terms of the way people dealt with each other, but Jackson still wanted the military law to prevail in defiance of the Constitution and civilian statutes. Some of Loyer's constituents filed an appeal with U.S. District Judge Dominic Augustin Hall, who issued a writ of habeas corpus. Rather than complying with that instrument, Jackson sent troops to have Judge Hall arrested. He then charged the judge with aiding, abetting, and executing mutiny within the camp, once again the city of New Orleans, and threw him into the same cell in which Loyer was detained. After being humiliated and briefly detained, Judge Hall was marched a short distance outside the camp and then released, which is to say he was sent into exile on the supposed authority of the military junta. And a few weeks later, Loyer, once again a civilian legislator, was subjected to a court-martial on numerous charges, including espionage, illegal and improper conduct, disobedience to orders, as if the military has the right to order a civilian to do something, and writing a willful and corrupt libel. A libel, of course, would be something that is false. There was nothing false in the anonymous broadside that Loyer had published. Loyer refused to recognize the jurisdiction of that spurious court, and he also rejected an offer of amnesty by which they had sought to brand me a criminal, he later wrote. He spent years thereafter trying to restore his reputation. Jackson, as I pointed out, was a warlord. For that reason, I contend, he's earned the abiding admiration of contemporary conservatives of a certain stripe, who see the Constitution as an impediment to permanent mobilization on behalf of the warfare state. Among that number is former U.S. Prosecutor Andrew McCarthy, who writes for National Review magazine, and he admiringly recounted the essentials of the story I just shared with you in an address to Hillsdale College, which is an institution that makes a fetish out of the Constitution. Unfortunately, McCarthy said in his address, "We've come a long way from Andrew Jackson to Barack Obama," inviting his audience to believe that the latter was a timid milquetoast who was scandalously unwilling to punish dissent through summary imprisonment and exiled judges who object to such abuses as due process. Bear in mind, in Barack Obama, we're talking about somebody who has used drone strikes to carry out the summary execution of U.S. citizens, including on one occasion a 16-year-old boy whose only supposed offense was to be the son of a radical cleric who had been designated an enemy of the state. Whatever sins you can impute to Obama, excessive fidelity to the Constitution and diffidence in the exercise of the distended powers of the imperial executive really can't be put on that list. The dead-eyed Maoist reptile called Hillary Clinton, who wants to succeed Obama, would certainly build on his accomplishments, but the same is true of the pathological narcissist named Donald Trump, whose signal accomplishment, I contend, is to bewitch the intelligence of many Republicans and, tragically, more than a few libertarians, in such fashion that they will now look with suspicion on people who criticize Trump and his proposals on the basis of the Constitution. And this was memorably displayed just a few days ago in Portland, Maine, during a Trump campaign appearance in which the crowd began chanting the favored refrain of the volitionally lobotomized jingoist USA, USA, after a small group of people silently protested by standing up while holding copies of the U.S. Constitution. Mr. Trump and his movement are sometimes called Jacksonian, and I believe that that's true in the worst sense of the expression. I will have a great deal more to say about this when I return. This is Will Grigg with Freedom Zealot Radio. Stand by for more sedition after this.
I carry this in my pocket out of affection for this document. At home, we have a stack of it sitting. Anytime a guest comes, we give them a copy of it.